Good evening. My name is Mike Biesiada, and I am a Ph.D. student from the College of Urban Affairs, and my advisor is Dr. Helen Neal. I'm interested in studying the impact of the Dodd-Frank Act on the financial markets, and I want to convey to you why this is important to public policy. In particular, I believe this presentation is relevant to the current presidential debate because the president is seen as someone that can spearhead legislation to address the most pressing public policy issues facing America. So let's start at the beginning, the 2008 financial crisis. Now, I know many of you remember the last recession, but I want to say a few quotes to remind us all of the severity that it had on the U.S. economy. Starting with President Obama in his 2016 State of the Union address. He said, "Food stamp recipients didn't cause the last crisis. Recklessness on Wall Street did." Then you have Professor Robert Shiller, a Nobel laureate in economics. He said that the Dodd-Frank Act protects the people from manipulative practices. And finally, Senator Elizabeth Warren, a notable bankruptcy scholar, she said that people feel like the system is rigged against them, and they're right. So I say this collection of quotes to remind us all that constituents at all levels were asking themselves the big question: what can we do to prevent another financial crisis? Well, one thing is clear. The free market is still fundamental to the U.S. economy, but we have rules in place to make sure that market actors play a fair game, play by the fair rules. Some examples of these rules, some examples of these ways include ways to prevent manipulative practices, insider trading, and monopolies. When market actors do not play by these fair rules, then it can affect Americans in various ways. Take, for example, the lead up to the last crisis. Interest rates rose, and this affected how much Americans paid for their mortgages, car loans, and student loans. After the crisis set in, unemployment rose, and this affected income level. And of course, who could forget, after the crisis set in, housing prices sunk dramatically. So after the crisis, legislators got together and they asked themselves, what rule makes sense to prevent another financial crisis? And out came the Dodd-Frank Act. It was signed into federal law by 2010. Now, this was a broad bipartisan act meant to address corporate governance among other areas. It was a broad bipartisan act, and it was put in place to protect both consumers and investors, so both sides of the equation. Now, some people believe that the Dodd-Frank Act is supposed to limit an executive's pay, or even the pool of executives that are eligible for certain pay amounts. This is in fact not the case. The purpose of the Dodd-Frank Act is to increase transparency through voting processes via shareholder rights and increase accountability through clawback rules. Now, if you take the sum of these parts and you put them together, you reduce moral hazard in the market. And what is moral hazard? Moral hazard is the notion that banks can do whatever they want, and if they fail, then the government would be there to bail them out with taxpayer money. So let's talk about a case study to really drive home this idea of corporate governance. Lehman Brothers was the fourth largest investment bank at the time of its collapse. You're looking at a chart of its stock price leading up to its demise. Most scholars agree that its collapse set off the financial crisis. So what did its corporate governance look like at the time of its collapse? Well, 9 out of the 10 directors were retired, and only 2 had current financial sector knowledge. And why is this important? Well, think about it in these terms. Let's say you're going to the doctor to get a surgery. You would like to think that that doctor has had continuing education within the past year or so. And why? Because this makes you feel more comfortable, like their skills are up to date. And the same should be true for boards of directors. So what was the end result in Lehman's case? Well, most scholars agree that a failure of its corporate governance led to exceeding internal risk limits and developing exposures to structured products, commercial real estate, and subprime lending. So what is corporate governance? Why does it matter, and why is it relevant to the current presidential debate? Well, corporate governance is essentially the board's responsibility to ensure that executives act in the best interests of shareholders. When you have a failure of corporate governance, it can adversely affect public policy because shareholders are put at undue risk. Now, some scholars believe that the Dodd-Frank Act is beneficial, going as far as to say that it did not go far enough. Now, others on the other side of the spectrum say They criticize the act for its regulatory burden, saying that its costs are going to far outweigh its benefits. So what are the research unknowns? Where does my study fall within this puzzle? Well, I'm interested in the role of executive compensation, which has actually been studied for many years. But what hasn't been studied is a comparison between real estate investment trusts and industrial firms. More specifically, I'm interested in the market response before and after the implementation of the Dodd-Frank Act within the framework of corporate governance. So what does the research literature have to say about this topic? Well, you're looking at a chart produced by the Economic Policy Institute, and it shows how close the relationship is between CEO compensation and stock market performance. So the question remains, is CEO compensation solely based on shareholder returns? Or do other metrics tell a better story? And does the Dodd-Frank Act have any impact on firm value within this context? These are the types of research questions that my study aims to address. So what are the practical implications of my study? Well, I believe it will be useful for various market actors, to include congressional representatives that may have to craft legislation in the future to deal with market malfeasance. Institutional investors such as insurance companies, pension funds, and endowments that ultimately have to invest into the markets. And finally, boards of directors and trustees that are ultimately responsible for overseeing the operations of these firms. Thank you very much.